Hi Awesome Blossoms, welcome to my channel. I'm Anna. Thank you so much for joining me again for another poetry book review. As I'm sure you can tell from the title, we are going to be talking about Felon by Reginald Dwayne Betts, as you can see here. I'm really excited to be talking about this poetry book. I purchased this book a while back. I have to admit, first of all, the title really got my attention. The beautiful cover really got my attention as well. But I have to say, his style of writing is one of the most gripping and convicting, and just, it has such presence. And the second that I finished it, I was literally mind blown. And I know that I say that a lot for a lot of poetry, and I don't think that takes away from the fact that you can be mind blown in different ways for different poets. But this poet, Reginald Dwayne Betts, there's a level of poetry that he has achieved for me, I guess personally, and just my experience with reading a lot of different poetry, that is so memorable, and I will never really forget the experience of reading his work for the first time. I've been making notes for the entire week on what I'm going to say and how I'm going to say it, and I have to admit that my thoughts have been very scattered and sort of like all over the place about this book, because as soon as I think of one thing that I want to talk about, I found something else that I want to talk about, and I've just been pulling from all these random thoughts that I have about this book, and it's been very hard to sort of condense it into like a single train of thought. It's really more like several trains going in different directions. It's kind of a mess up here, but I think what I'm going to do is, because there's so much that I want to talk about, and I don't want to cram it all into one sitting, because I know that it's kind of hard to watch someone prattle on about poetry for like 30 minutes or more. I'm going to do my best to put this out in 2 parts, so that you guys can watch part 1 in a reasonable amount of time and part 2 in an equally reasonable amount of time. So now that we have that down, let us get into the poetry. Okay, the first thing that we're going to talk about, as usual, before we get into the actual poetry is, of course, the poet, Mr. Reginald Dwayne Betts, who, by the way, what an epic name. That is a name that commands attention and respect. Perfect poetry name. He is quite an inspiration. So from an article that I found about him, because I was searching for inspiration on how to say what I wanted to say about this book, and so I was looking up information about the poetry, and inevitably found information about Mr. Betts as well. And so his story was published in one of the articles I found that I will link in the description, where at 15 he was convicted of a crime and was sentenced to serve 9 years in prison. He served 8 years and some change out of that 9 years, and was released, and then proceeded to go and get his education. He has a master's degree, and he also went to the Yale School of Law. So he has a wealth of knowledge to share, but in addition to that, he has context on both sides, I suppose, of the spectrum. And so his perspective, the way that he shares his story through this book, very unique. And obviously it would be unique because it's his story, and only he can tell his story. So Reginald has had a Guggenheim Fellowship, among many others. He is really quite accomplished, and he's one of those people that I think inspire his readers to see that we can achieve really anything that we want, with the hard work, the dedication, maybe the support as well, because he's supported by so many people that he loves. And the beauty of poetry really is that it inspires community. It inspires like-minded people to get together and be like, wow, I really love the work that you're doing. How do I come alongside you and be a part of that or help you with that? His story is one of those stories that has really inspired me, and hopefully you, in understanding that it's not just about the poetry or the words that you write down or that we read. It's about everything behind it that inspires those words, and I can really feel that in his work. Okay, so we're gonna get into the poetry now. Felon is composed of 34 poems, and while that may not seem like a lot, each poem has its own presence, is packed with such imagery and weight that you do not feel, you really feel like you're reading a lot more than 34 poems, thankfully, because I was really sad when I finished the book. I wanted to keep going and there was no more. But he has 2 other books that I will be purchasing at some point. So there is more of his work out there for us to read. So I'm going to break up these sections. I'm gonna break up the sections into discussing forms and also themes for this video. We're gonna talk about forms. So forms are typically the structures of maybe more things that we consider as more classical poetry. So you have your sonnets, which a lot of people know about. Usually they think of Shakespeare when they think of sonnets, although there are also Italian, I think they're called Petrarchan sonnets. And of course, you know, those are 14 lines. Each line is alternately rhyming, and then you have a couplet at the end that those also rhyme. They're usually in what we call iambic pentameter, which is like, it's basically I think it's called meter, and it's basically 5 like meters within a line. So it has like this rhythm of 5 beats in the line, if that makes sense. He also begins the book with a form called the ghazal, which I think I'm saying that right. There's a lot of moving parts in the ghazal. I'm going to have it come up on I'm going to type out pretty much all of the basic sort of requirements for what a ghazal would need to make it one. But essentially the background is that it comes from Arabic poetry. It's usually called amatory poetry or an ode in the Arabic forms, and it is an expression of pain and loss and separation, and it originates out of the 7th century. I had to write one for one of my poetry classes, and I think it was a really good practice for me to do that because well, one, at that point I had never heard of one, and so it was quite challenging to have to write one like that. But it has a sort of a cyclical feel to it because you have repeating lines all the way through, and so it sort of reiterates itself as it develops, and it's really quite interesting to read. And so you are introduced to a ghazal in the very first poem of this book, which delighted me to no ends, as I'm sure you can imagine. He also delves into some, I guess people would normally call it blackout poetry, although he doesn't. Because his is more, I think, with a different purpose than blackout poetry. So he calls this project, because it is a project that he's worked on, is called redacted poetry. And so he takes articles from various cities that are talking about specifically bail for people who are in court, who are convicted or are awaiting trial in court and need to post bail but can't afford to. And so the poetry is, he takes court cases and redacts out the lines that are not necessary, and sort of crafts the story of the marginalized within that structure, and paints this picture of a different history, basically. To me, it is really not only a retelling of history, but sort of a revision of history, in that all of history, as we've been taught, has always made us think that the justice system was just. And he is, through the stories of these people, he is showing us that that is not the case. he is really painting a different picture, revising history per se, to show the true stories of people whose stories and voices have not been heard. The next thing that I want to talk about are the themes in this book, because there are quite a lot and they overlap, and the ones that I could pinpoint are, to me, massively important in our day and age. Not only just within this month, because I do realize that I'm doing this in Black History Month. Not necessarily intentionally, I think it just sort of worked out that way. But we don't need to just be thinking about these themes and these realities in this month, but sort of all of the time. And so, or just being aware of them more and more often, so that we can tap into our compassion and our mercy and our understanding for other people's struggles and lives. So the themes that I could find that really stood out to me in this collection of poetry, and this is really in no particular order of priority. It's just sort of what I remembered at the time and how I wrote it down. But he focuses a lot, of course, on the past, the regrets that the poet feels about his past, and sort of how that influences the way that he goes about his present. There is also a fixation, obviously, then on guilt, but he compounds that with God and religion, and how he views those things together, how they sort of conflict in his mind. And then also, I guess, the idea of maybe the grace of God, and how sometimes that those two things do not equate for him in his experiences. And then, of course, he talks about relationships, the woman that he loves. The poet sometimes feels that, or at least it appears that, he feels almost not fully there for her, because part of his identity has been altered so drastically by the prison system. And so coming out of that, the aftermath of that, has really shaken his identity to the point where the man that this woman is expecting him to be may not always be someone that he can live up to, and sort of the weight and maybe even guilt that surrounds that. And then he obviously talks about incarceration, which is really the crux of this book, and how it wreaks havoc on the family structure, on identity, on the children, on love and intimacy, on honesty, all of these really important things that should sort of fall into place naturally. The aftermath of incarceration sort of distorts them, or it may make achieving them a lot harder, or even put them entirely out of reach. He really does struggle with identity in this collection of, how do I reconcile my past self, my present self, and sort of this self in the middle, the incarcerated self? How do I reconcile all of these identities into one, when all of them seem to be conflicting at the same time? It's really a struggle. He is truly wrestling with this idea of identity. So he inevitably gets onto the topic of systematic injustice in America, because it is prevalent and doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon, unfortunately. However, there are organizations that are working to combat the injustice that people face in the system. We will be talking a lot more about the redacted poems in the second video, in part 2. I just wanted to bring up that as a theme, that he talks a lot about systematic injustice, and really focuses on the injustice of bail, which is actually a really big deal. And I want to devote more time to that in the second part of this review. So we'll get into that in the second video. Another theme that he expresses is the hope that he has for his children. He has 2 sons. The fear mixed with hope, mixed with love, mixed with this desire to protect them from the world that they are going to grow up in, and how he struggles to work out those emotions when he looks at his children, and what the future is going to be like for them in light of this color of their skin, in light of who their father is, in light of the way this country's history has been for 400 years. It is a weight that parents must carry. It's a reality that parents face every day of not being able to ensure the safety of their children solely because of the color of their skin. And it is a fear that should not be present, but yet has almost always been present. And so this theme shows up in his work of how he feels about his children in light of those dark realities. Then he also expresses, and this is the last theme that I wrote about, he also expresses a fear of his own future, of what incarceration means for his future, and how he can lay that in the past, or if he even can lay that in the past. The aftermath of incarceration takes a toll on a person physically, socially, mentally, spiritually. Any type of aspect of identity that you can think of, incarceration touches and leaves a scar on. And so he also grapples with that idea of, what is my life going to be like now that I'm supposedly free? How do I lay these burdens down? How do I cast this off? Can I cast this off? Should I cast this off? All of these questions that he has had to go through, he brings up in his poetry and sort of fleshes it out in beautiful, beautiful ways. So I'm going to also talk about some little points that I loved about his work. First of all, his poetry is so rich in reference, to the point where I know for a fact that I have not caught all of the references, and sort of all of the little, I guess you could say, Easter eggs, if you want to call it that he leaves behind for the reader to find. That is why you have to read it multiple times. I have had to look up so many words in the dictionary because it's almost above my reading level, which is great. And so I got to learn a lot of new words, a lot of new references. It was really a study for me to read this work. I think his perspective is very unique, and the way that he expresses his perspective is very unique. It is obviously drenched in reality. It is not the type of hopefulness that one gets from just saying, well, the sun is shining, everything's going to be okay. It's more of a hopefulness grounded in reality. And so his life has been hard, and it has obviously been filled with many struggles, but I want to pull from another poem that I found recently called The Audacity of Depression. I'm going to link the poet and the performance down below because I'm referencing it now. But in that poem, the poet states that we do not survive by accident, we survive on purpose. And I think Reginald has found his purpose in poetry, of like the struggles that he has gone through. They have been hard, they have been painful. Some of them have been, or should have been, avoidable, but yet they found him anyways. And he has managed to find a venue, an avenue of expression that allows people to look at him and look at his life and say, I relate to that, or I now understand better what needs to be done in this country, or what needs to be done in me to understand better and to be more empathetic and to love people and to put my biases aside and to put my racism aside. All of these things. He has found a way to show the world a different way of looking at things, a different perspective. I think it's a really important feature of this book that instead of outrightly calling out those who are to blame for systematic injustice, for white supremacy, for the superiority that people feel over others, he really does focus on his story and but yet his story, like many others, are weaved into the fabric of America's history, and it's a bloody history, and how he doesn't always explicitly state who or what is at fault, yet he is showing people that this is part of the Black experience. The Black experience encompasses a range of experiences. It's not just one experience. It's not just one singular thing that defines Black people in America or people of color in America. But this is a reality. This is part of it. This is a bloody history that we have had to endure for 400 years and even more. Yet he doesn't have to say any of that because, and what I really do appreciate about his work is that he assumes the intelligence of his audience, and he knows that he doesn't necessarily need to state all of that because we know, we feel it, and it is, yet it is silently embedded in his work to the point where when he tells his story, you understand the context already without him having to say it. And it sort of saves him the burden of having to rehash that. He can really now, in his poetry, focus on the healing and the, I guess, catharsis that comes with expressing one's own story. This book, I feel, is somewhat of a condemnation on the justice system, yet never stating that outrightly. Just its presence in and of itself, I feel, is a condemnation. In the same way that I felt that Ilya Kaminsky's collection, Deaf Republic, was also a condemnation, although a bit more outright, of the way violence and injustice is seen here. I really appreciate that about his writing. I think it's approaching the subject from a different angle, and it's one that I don't really see very often or even at all in other poetry. And so I really did love that about his work. Another really cool thing about this book is the formatting. So it's not just about the words, it's how they appear on the page. He really does like to play around with enjambment, which is where he puts his line breaks. He likes to play around with white space, and of course he also likes to use a lot of double meanings, which for me, it's like poetry puns, almost, but not as pithy as that. He does typically write in stanzas or blocks, so pretty much up and down, but sometimes there are poems that are broken up and jagged and sort of all over the page, and you have to follow it. And it's interesting to see the ones that he chooses to do that with, and then the ones that he chooses to keep more traditional. He also is so good at imagery. Like, he has a phrase in one of his poems, the phrase daffodils of poverty. And it's like, how does one come up with that? How do you continue to be so consistent with the mind-blowing content, is what I really would like to ask him. I have no words. Sometimes it's really the only thing I can do is just sit there in this stunned silence and just be like, wow, he really did that. He really just wrote that down and killed me. Wow, great, we love that. I wrote down that his imagery is devastating and unique specifically only to him, and I stand by that. Lastly, I want to talk about one specific thing that I noticed about his work that really intrigued me. He speaks a lot about God, but the way that he spells God is not G-O-D. It is G-D, in that he doesn't put the O in. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if that is just a way of keeping someone's attention or getting the reader's attention, or if there's a deeper meaning. I sometimes wonder if it is in reference to maybe the struggle in and of itself to say or spell or think about God in light of the struggles that one has faced. And if in this setting, if to spell the name out is to admit that he exists and what that means for the poet should he do that, I kind of wonder if it's a sign of some deeper emotion, maybe doubt or anger or fear, or all of them that are conflicting, and so the poet cannot bear to spell the name out because maybe then he will have to face a whole nother reality that he's not ready for, or is not willing to face at the moment. So that was a really interesting thing that I noticed in this work. There are so many more interesting things about this poetry that I have not even managed to scratch the surface on, but I hope that this video has inspired you initially to pick the book up and read it. I will be doing part 2 very soon on not only specific poems that I want to talk about, the redacted poetry project that he's doing, but also I really want to go more in depth into the last poem, House of Unending, which is, in my opinion, the magnum opus of this collection. I think that poem has I will never forget that poem on how it has been written and the impact that it has had on me. So I want to give it as much time as I possibly can. That is all I have for this video for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to know more about Reginald Dwayne Betts, I will find as much information as I can on him, all the articles that I can find, and I will link them in the description. You can also find him on Instagram. I will put his Instagram also in the description below. You can also follow me on Instagram at the Poets Corner 46, and I post about works that I read. I post my own poetry and any sort of thoughts that I have on stuff that I'm reading currently. Thank you so much for watching, you guys. Have a great rest of your day, week, month, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.